been talking about different ways to help people adopt more sustainable behaviors and what works and what doesn't. And Joel, I wanted to hear a little bit more about the research that you started to describe work you're doing, I think, up at Dickinson College.
Right, yeah. Thanks, John. So I am finishing up my doctorate at George Mason, but doing my research on energy efficiency at Dickinson College. And so it's really tied in well to our topic, since I'm applying behavioral economics to see if that can be applied in ways we incentivize energy efficiency, and specifically using some theories that you may have read in the book Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, recent Nobel Prize winning Richard Thaler. So one of the theories he helped promote was this idea of loss aversion, where people tend to get more disutility out of losing something than the utility they get of gaining the same thing. So it's like they hate losses more than like gains. So one area in energy efficiency, which we have some incentives, we can talk maybe a little bit more about that, but a few utilities are using pay for performance. They're giving consumers financial incentives to use less than their baseline power. So it's a behavioral change, financial, and that's a few utilities are running those sorts of programs. And what I'm trying to find out is if we can front load those benefits. So if I'm going to give Jenna 5 cents a kilowatt hour for every unit of energy she comes in below her baseline, what if we front loaded that? What if we said, hey, Jenna, I'm going to tell you what the maximum you can get from this incentive, and I'm going to set up an account in your name, and I'm going to call it an escrow. Then she starts seeing this incentive go down. And so it's the same incentive these other companies are doing, but she's going to be seeing it as the period of performance goes along as a loss. So I sort of stumbled on this thinking this had maybe been done somewhere in some country, some faraway land, but it hasn't actually been done. And so I'm really trying to simplify this, and I'm doing it at a university at Dickinson College, looking at plug level loads, just plug level loads, working with an energy management company out of Maryland called Gopher. And so I'm continuously able to detect their levels, and they have an app, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about real-time feedback. But we're getting some reaction, behavioral change, just having the application. But then later on in this program, I'm going to have the financial incentives given in a different sort of way. And yeah, I think it'll be interesting. You probably figure out what my hypothesis is, but maybe we can move this along as a behavioral, an option that utilities can have to incentivize energy efficiency. So that's sort of my sandbox, and I'm sort of interested in all things, behavioral economics, and there's a lot of sort of cognitive barriers that keep people from doing what they state they want to do, but there are reasons and barriers why they don't do that. So, yeah.
Well, I have a question for you, and I guess all of us are interested in behavioral economics and what works behaviorally. And in the work that I do with Arlington's Energy Committee, we're looking at the county's effort to basically revise and update its community energy plan, which is one of many, many energy plans many communities have that set goals as ambitious as communities are able to go. And many now, more than 100 across the country now, have adopted the goal of 100% renewable electricity as a near-term goal, and 100% renewable energy as a whole as a long-term goal. And I'm wondering, how do you guys feel about the effectiveness of these kind of short, medium, and long-term community-wide goals that are, very ambitious, I'd say? Are they effective? Do they get Do they get people to actually change their behaviors? Do they work, across sectors?
Well, one thing we found at Mobility Lab, we're a think tank that specializes in understanding how people make the transportation decisions they do. So why you chose to take Metro one day and then take the bus the next day or drive alone the next day. And one thing we found is that people, even people who want to make a change for the environment, behavior that's more sustainable, even people who state that they want to do that, it's hard for them to make a change that changes their lifestyle completely. So the idea of electric vehicles is more amenable to people than taking public transportation, because purchasing an electric vehicle instead of your petroleum car doesn't change the way your life works, because you still live in a detached home and still drive everywhere. You don't have to think about your transportation choices every single time you get in the car. But the bus, that's a complete change of how you do things. You might bring reusable bags with you, or you might bring an umbrella just in case it rains. So it's all these little tiny things that add up that we found play a big role in the big decisions about people's behavior. So all these little tiny things that change your lifestyle is why people don't want to do sustainable things. And I guess that's the same thing with energy, is when you put the burden on people to change their behavior, turning the lights off, that their quality of life is different. And it's hard to, we found it's possible, but it's hard.
So what works? What have you found is most effective in transportation in motivating people to make those difficult changes, the lifestyle changes?
The number one thing in the field of transportation demand management, which is all about helping people drive alone less, so in carpools or buses or bikes, the number one thing is you have to make the sustainable choice the absolute easiest choice. And there's a variety of ways you could do that with, like you said, smartphone apps that tell you exactly when the bus is coming, so now that uncertainty is not a factor. Bus stops that have shelters, so when it rains you're protected, and benches so you could sit down while you're waiting. All of these things all these little things that make sustainable choices easier is what makes people ultimately want to do them. Yeah.
So what I've found in what I've researched is what is most effective for good governance is good governance is when people don't realize it's happening. Kind of set and forget. Most people, when they flip on the light switch, they don't think about the entire process of how energy is mined, burned, the whole transmission process. They don't think about that. They don't want to. They want to pay their bill and go about their day. But if they choose to be sustainable, asking them to make a decision like flipping a switch on and off 14 times a day, that's, even if they're well-intentioned, that's a decision they have to make 14 times a day. Every day they have to commit to it. It'll annoy them. But it's much better when there are solutions that are more set, maybe not set in stone, but more set. So asking people to re-audit their homes, do an energy audit for their homes, to see, that's a bigger ask than if the building codes were right in the first place to have either a net zero home or so on and so forth. So when it comes to the solutions for climate change, that sort of thing, it means in some cases more regulation or more financial incentives. Some people like that, some people don't. But when 90% of energy use and 90% of infrastructure is in the hands of private entities as opposed to homeowners or the government itself, you kind of have to choose your options.
So you're saying policies like building codes.
Yes.
The things that work in the background are
yes.
work best.
Yes.
Really interesting.
I kind of circle back to one of your questions, though. I think having targets is very, very important, just from a governance accountability perspective. a lot of times you see maybe governments, state, local, even federal, set goals that are maybe overly ambitious. But I think this may be part of my military background coming up. But every time there was a target, sort of a quantitative thing that was indisputable. It's not squishy. We have a target. We have some plan to get there. Whether we get there or not, we'll find out along the way. But I think I'm of the mindset. I really think it's important that governments try to push for targets.
And I guess something that I've been thinking about a lot recently with the headlines, with the new ICCP report and the COP24 meeting in Poland. It's a Bill McKibben quote that means a lot to me, and that is winning slowly at climate change is the same as losing. That we don't have time. We don't have the luxury of taking a careful, stepwise, long-term approach to behavior change. We need to figure out how to do things pretty quickly compared to, for example, the way we approach cigarette smoking or some other things that we were happy to take a generation for whatever reason to change. So how do we move faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so one thing that is, now that I have a few years under my belt, but like the way we approach recycling now is not even a second thought. And I mean, I remember how it did feel like a change. It was a bit of a struggle, sort of, but there are ways where communities can make it more convenient.
Single stream.
Having more,
number one, yeah.
containers that separate and things like that. I mean, I don't even think twice about recycling, but it was a tough behavioral change, and whether we have that amount of time to sort of on the carbon front is debatable, but it is tough changes are doable across communities. So.
Well, I think going back to Nudge with what a great book, but with choice architecture, the whole point of why recycling is successful is that it's so easy to make the choice to recycle. Because with cities and regions that have single stream recycling, you don't have to look at the back of the container for one tiny little number and figure out what exact bin it goes in on which day of the week. You just throw it in there, and those areas have a much higher rate of success with recycling than other places. So it's all about, I really believe it's all about just making it so easy for people to be sustainable. And unfortunately we really have a huge challenge ahead of us, not just in the energy sector, but with transportation, which is the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions nationally, and that comes almost entirely from personal cars. And the biggest chunk of personal car trips are less than 6 miles, something that easily could be done with a bike, an electric bike, a bus, a train, you name it.
A scooter.
A scooter, yeah, scooters. We love the scooters now. But the reason why it's hard for people to do all those other things is because the towns and cities we've designed are for cars. So we don't really, unless we really rethink about how we design our cities and make it easier for people to walk and easier for people to take their bikes and go on the bus, then driving will be the best choice for people, unless we do anything we can to make it easier to not. Yeah.
You bring up a really big challenge is the path dependencies we are on. So when it comes to our supply structure, we, starting back in the 20s, it started as a hub and spoke, and big generators, and arguably, I think if we were starting from scratch, we had no generation, and we were just going to. I think most people might argue we should develop from distributed generation. So, unfortunately, that's not possible. We can't go back in time, but that transition from the way things are. We have streets. They came from horses. So those streets came from other forms of transportation. But it's it's this sort of just inherited challenges you have that are real, and you can't, unfortunately, you can't ignore them, and they have a life expectancy, and so you need, when does it make sense to phase it out, and those sorts of
sure.
things.
When you have most of Arlington developed as single-family homes,
Right.
geographically,
Yeah.
not population-wise, but that creates
But the fascinating
challenges.
thing about Arlington is that, in the 60s when people were first talking about Metro, which already was revolutionary in a time, coming right off building the interstate highway system. Here are people in Washington, D.C. wanting to build a urban subway. The federal planners wanted Metro, the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, the orange and now the silver lines, but then it was just the orange line. They wanted it to be the median of I-66. So instead of going on the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, it would have gone on the median of I-66, and every one of those stations would have been a park and ride lot. Every single one. We wouldn't have had the urban villages we have today, of Clarendon, of Ballston, Virginia Square, all these great walkable communities. So it is possible to, Arlington's not, as dense as Farragut Square or any other, DC neighborhood, but it is possible with, smart planning decisions to make those walkable communities in places we already have. And just so easily, the Orange Line could have been just a commuter rail line, but now it's a real, it's a spine of a walkable community, and that's so important. And we can make those choices with the neighborhoods we have now. So we have to be wary of it.
There's another factor with commuting that actually I could draw a parallel with recycling. Growing up, I always had recycling around, and it got easier and easier over the years. But there kind of exists this pressure now socially, where if your friends will call you out if they see you throwing something plastic or something made of aluminum into the trash. So do you guys think there's any possibility that someday commuting could have those same kind of social pressures of really you're driving your own car to work today when we have all this public transit available, all
Hope
these
so.
other options?
I shame all my friends, always. I really hope so. But one thing I think that could really help that is, going back to apps, a lot of commuting apps use gamification to encourage people to ride more. It's just like, at Starbucks, how every time you get a coffee, they, put a little hole in, well, it's probably high tech now, like with an app, but all these little.
Like a reward system.
Yeah, like a reward system, yeah. And, Uber has it, Bird scooters have it, all these things to keep you coming back and making your trips public. But I don't think it's happening enough. And one thing when you started talking, I was thinking of was, I don't think the company's around anymore, but O-Power, have you heard of them? Yeah.
They actually got absorbed by Oracle.
Oh,
So,
right, yeah.
yeah.
Well, what they did, I remember hearing about it, was you would, at your home, you'd be shipped a mailer, just like a letter that said, your neighbors used X amount less energy than you did. And it's that kind of shame really gets people to lower their energy consumption.
Over meta-analysis over large studies that have been done with the energy reports, it's about 5%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a very low-cost program. I mean, if you can lower an average household demand by 5%, that's
huge.
That's significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's just one norming tool, right?
Yeah.
We can imagine. Actually, I think the idea, you mentioned games, and I really think that's interesting because I think there's a lot of possibilities of people love to play games.
They do.
I mean, they're constantly playing games. You can make some of these sort of incentives sort of fun. And one of the things I'm curious about with the students that I'm running an experiment on is, I'm thinking when they have this escrow and they're monitoring every day, some of them will probably be obsessed with it. But I think they will probably challenge themselves. They'll kind of get a sense for how much they're using, and today's going to be a $2 day. You know what I mean? Like a self sort of game. I'm averaging $2.50, but this is going to be a $2 day. And then you can see where companies might get kind of creative about hey, we noticed you had a $2 day. Here's a coffee. You know,
Yes,
you
yeah,
can start building
totally.
on those interests that, that people sort of create for themselves. I think there's a lot
Yeah.
there that hasn't really been navigated. It's pretty interesting.
I was going to say I really like the idea of the instant feedback too. Around my college campus, and actually where I'm starting to see these all over the place now. The new water fountains that count how many plastic bottles you've saved. So the water's running into your reusable one as you're filling it up, and it's saying, "Hey, today, this water fountain has saved this many hundreds of bottles of water." So I really like any kind of idea that would be similar to that.
Even when you're competing against yourself, it seems to
Sure,
work.
yeah.
Which this is probably a good question for you. I've always, in all my writing on Mobility Lab and all of our research, I've noticed that shame's not the right word, I guess, but disincentives seem to work more than incentives. Like giving someone $5 is different than taking away $5 or knowing that somebody else earned $5. The best example that comes to mind is a city in Estonia, Tallinn. They tried completely free public transportation, and it was successful in increasing transit ridership, but not as much as they thought. And the reason some researchers found was because the cost of driving was still cheap. So it's I guess, and maybe it's not the same thing, but the fact that driving was expensive prevented people from capitalizing, or driving was cheap prevented people from,
I think that's a really important point. Why it is challenging. Electricity costs, even now, fuel costs, relatively speaking, in real terms, in real prices, are historically low.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a challenging time when we don't have. We're talking about carbon tax. When we don't have a carbon tax, which, if we were being stewards and putting the true cost of items, true costs of externalities into it, we would have an easier time. Well, naturally, getting behavioral change, but it's tough to work around that constraint where it's cheap energy that's not really reflective of the true costs.
Well, and I wanted to talk a little bit about if people see much of a possibility. So in Virginia, at the state level, there's a proposal to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that is a multi-state effort that approximates a carbon fee or tax. And nationally, there are serious efforts underway, probably not going to be very successful, with the current Congress or White House. But looking a couple of years down the road, how do people feel about a carbon fee, a carbon tax, a price on carbon as kind of the ultimate nudge and the most?
Well, that gets really political real quick.
Yeah.
So they've done some studies and say, okay, I wouldn't mind having, green energy if I had to pay 10% more on my energy bill, or 20 or 30. And it was pretty popular. You could get like 70% of people, I think, would agree to that. But carbon taxes and carbon markets are often a hard sell. And they're certainly not going to pass at the federal level at this exact moment. So it's up to the state houses to try and pass such a measure. Virginia, it's a little funky because in the Constitution they can't set up a third party to tax. And so they're trying to figure out how to make that work to join the RGGI system. But we'll see what happens with that. But once you have a carbon tax or a carbon market, you end up producing money. What do you do with this money? You can fix the budget. You can do a tax and dividend where you basically give it back to the people. But once you say carbon tax, people don't hear dividend. I think they ought to call it a carbon tax cut. I think that would work much better because closer to reality. When something similar, the CARB standards and CAFE standards for automobiles. They say, okay, to companies, okay, you hit the standard, and if you don't, then you have to pay money. But you have to pay money to your competitor who is hitting the standard, such as, so if you're GM or Ford and you're not hitting your miles per hour gallon goals, you have to pay Tesla. They hate that. And it's very effective. The way businesses are set up, it's about money, money, and money. So if you're looking for gigantic change real quick, it's going to be a carbon tax, carbon market, or some sort of fee, but it's going to be an uphill battle to get it passed.
People don't want to pay for something that they have for free.
Yeah.
Always. It's the same thing with the fight against congestion pricing, which really is, for people who don't know, congestion pricing is just demand pricing for roads. It's rush hour. This highway is really busy, so you should charge to be you should pay to be able to access it, so traffic flows. And in all the cities, in Europe, like London, they have a congestion pricing scheme. There's no downtown traffic, and it really works. And but no new city in the United States has it. The only example is I-66, which is here, and it's the reason why people hate it is because it used to be free. Even though you were sitting in traffic for hours and it was hours of lost productivity and time, at least you chose to be there, and it was free.
You're getting your money's worth, yeah.
It's just so.
I did see that there's been some change in behavior, modest though, but that there is additional carpooling in response to that, because you can carpool for free on I-66.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a huge incentive for people to join carpools, to form van pools at their companies. Carpools and van pools can be hard logistically, but now there are so many, apps, different software that can make it so easy, which helps a lot.
And then the other thing people are doing is just learning when it's affordable to be on I-66, so that spreads the traffic out over the longer rush hour.
It makes sense if you look at roads as purely like an economic resource. It makes so much sense, and I agree. It helps people drive alone less. It keeps traffic flowing. But it used to be free, and that's the hang-up.
So it sounds like you would be in favor of real-time pricing of electricity. But it's similar. One thing I think is important not to miss in the value of a tax, carbon markets, is the innovation that it would instill. So I think there is a consensus among economists that taxing carbon is the most efficient way of reducing carbon footprint, but the sort of knock-on effects shouldn't be underestimated. Probably more efficient than maybe a dedicated government program to be more innovative is if you have the price signal to industry, private industry, they're going to innovate faster. And I don't think we really fully understand the benefits of what even a modest tax might be on the auto industry, on generation and renewable providers as well, and even nuclear power. We don't we kind of forget we haven't built any new nuclear power. We've built one nuclear power plant in the last 40 years, but that's still out there as a major carbon free source of energy. So.
What I struggle with at Mobility Lab, writing about transportation and sustainability, is getting people to think about taxes like that and making helping people see that this actually works, even though it's hard at first. It actually works, and your quality of life is not only does your quality of life stay the same, but it can get better because of all these great things that will come with it. So how do you, when you talk about carbon taxes, how do you find successful ways to break down people's preconceptions?
So to kind of bring it back to the CAFE standards and CARB standards for cars. You have a standard for the industry to meet. The industry doesn't like having to hit a regulation, but if it's even for everybody, then it's kind of okay. So while it's important that they hit it to miles per gallon and not say everyone go electric, because what if you have air cars or hydroelectric cars or hydrogen cars? The goal is the goal, not the solution. You don't want to pick a winner ahead of time. So what has happened? So yes, electric cars, hybrids, blah, 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 but you have seen a huge revolution in gasoline cars. Hybrids, yes, but even the things that gasoline cars are made of, they're now, carbon fiber is now standard, fairly standard in many of the car outsides because it's lighter and harder than aluminum. And they standardized turbochargers in car, which is a racing car part. Ford EcoBoost commercials, they probably hear them talk about more power. Well, really, they're doing it because it also increases miles per gallon. And so it's just one way in which when you set a good standard and set up the market in such a way, you can create innovation.
I guess that gets back to what the right standards is and how ambitious we need to be, to get where we need to go. And kind of brings me back to ambitious goals that we can all work toward, and
I
that
agree. Goals are important.
we can kind of do it all at once.